in the skull. He says that there was this residue in the skull that he could tell by looking at it was remnants of the decomposition of Kaylee's brain. And because of the position that he could tell that the skull was on its side. He acknowledged that he took a sample of it, that he doesn't know if it's ever been tested or not. So we brought in Dr. Bruce Goldberger from the University of Florida, who washed the inside of the skull, tested it, and told you that there is no decomposition product inside that skull. So he did the test that Dr. Spitz said he didn't do, said he couldn't do because he didn't have a laboratory. And we now know that it's not what Dr. Spitz thought it was. So Dr. Spitz's whole theory of that proving that the skull was on its side has now been disproven. You'll also recall in cross-examination, I pointed out to Dr. Spitz that the arrangement of the hair mass was not consistent with his theory of how the skull decomposed. That, in fact, remember we talked about how if the skull is on its side, the hair mass is going to fall to the side, it's not going to fall evenly, blah, blah, blah. And you can look at those photographs, you'll have them all back in the jury room, and you can look at them and you'll see. I also asked Dr. Spitz an interesting question that counsel somewhat criticized me for asking. He acknowledged that in determining the manner of death, it is absolutely essential for a forensic pathologist to know about the events leading up to the death or disappearance of the victim. It's common sense. He said, yes, you have to know that. You have to know as much as you can about that. So I asked Dr. Spitz, well, what did you know? What information were you given? What research did you do? He said, well, I went to the house. Well, what do you remember from the house? Just that there was a pool. That's all he remembered. Well, what did you know about the events, leading up to her disappearance, etc.? Well, there was something about a nanny. That's all he knew. I would submit to you that his fund of information about this case is not sufficient to make his opinion credible in this case. That in fact, the evidence in this case shows that the medical legal investigation of this case was thorough and complete, and that the testimony of Dr. Garavaglia and Dr. Utz and Dr. Schultz and Dr. Warren is credible and is worthy of your belief. Now, let's talk next about the entomological evidence. It wasn't a big feature of the case. It wasn't huge, but counsel referred to it, so let's talk about it. You heard from two entomologists. One was Dr. Neil Haskell. Been practicing in this field, has been a leader in this field for, I think he said, 30 years, practicing in forensic entomology. He told you two opinions, essentially. One about the car and one about the scene. You heard from Dr. Timothy Huntington, who has been practicing in his field since he received his PhD in 2008. A very bright young man, and I don't mean to denigrate his education or his sincerity, but the fact of the matter is you have to decide who you find more believable. Someone who has been practicing in the field for 25 or 30 years, or someone who's been practicing in the field for 3. But again, there are things they agree on. They agree on this very important fact, that the evidence at the scene where Kaylee's body was found indicates that the body initially decomposed in some other location from which the early colonizing flies were restricted. That's what Dr. Haskell told you. Dr. Huntington said he agreed that wherever Kaylee's body was for the first few days of decomposition, those early flies could not get to her. And then she was taken and dumped there in the woods, in that swampy area that you heard described by so many people. They both agree that occurred sometime in June or July 2008, based on the entomological evidence. In that, they agree. So what Dr. Haskell said about the scene, Dr. Huntington agrees with. Where they diverge is in the single issue of whether the trunk would have excluded the early colonizing flies. That's the only place that they disagree. Dr. Haskell, with his 25 years of experience in the field, has told you that in his opinion, the trunk is a source that could have excluded the early colonizing fly. Dr. Huntington, who candidly admits that he has never in his career dealt with a dead body in a trunk in a real-world situation, but based upon some experiments applying conditions completely different than in this case. Remember, that's the pigs in the blanket comment that we made. That based upon that experiment, and that experiment alone, he renders the opinion that the trunk would not have excluded the early colonizers. Again, it is up to you to decide which expert is more credible, or which you believe, or to believe neither. It is completely up to you. But the important thing is on what they agree. That body decomposed someplace else, that it was somehow, either by being wrapped or being stored, was in a situation where the early flies could not get to it. And that from June or July through December, it sat there in the woods. On that they agree. All right, let's go to the area next of the chloroform. Mr. Bias had a nice big poster about that, had all the experts or people that talked about chloroform. What is important to understand in evaluating the various people who testified about chloroform is to understand, first, what they were testing, and second, what their perspective was. Now, remember, Mr. Bias made a good deal of comment on the adjectives used by Dr. Voss and Dr. Weiss versus the adjectives used by Dr. Rickenbach. But one thing you have to understand in assessing those adjectives is their perspective. Dr. Voss and Dr. Weiss are used to looking at environmental air samples. Remember, Dr. Weiss told you that he's looked at environmental air samples from all kinds of different, fuel, car exhausts, environmental conditions, industrial, but all different areas. And he's told you that based upon that experience, that he felt that the amount of chloroform he was seeing in the sample from the trunk was high, was surprising, because of what his experience is. Dr. Voss's experience is similar. What he's looking at is samples from dead bodies, and he's seen many of them. He told you that based upon what he has seen in decomposing bodies, and he has occasionally seen chloroform in those cases, in very small amounts. But compared to that, what he saw was shockingly high. But taking away the adjectives, the important thing is more to say, what did they actually find? Dr. Weiss and Dr. Voss told you that the chloroform they found in the trunk air sample in the can was somewhere in the low parts per million range. And Dr. Weiss gave you an excellent explanation of the idea of quantification. He said quantification would not have meant anything in this case, because even if you quantify the amount of chloroform in the being given off by the carpet, it doesn't mean anything in terms of the amount of chloroform that was there a month before, because chloroform is volatile. It evaporates. So it wouldn't mean anything. But he does say, Dr. Voss says, that based upon the qualitative analysis and the comparison between the amount of chloroform and the limits of his machine and the controls, that it was somewhere in the low parts per million range.